In the summer of 1942, German panzers were advancing so fast through southern Russia that Soviet units couldn't even organize a retreat. The 1st Panzer Army covered 480 kilometers in under 2 weeks. Rostov had fallen, the steppe was wide open, and ahead of them was the most valuable real estate in the entire war. The Caucasus oil fields, producing 80% of all Soviet fuel. Germany was so confident it sent 15,000 oil workers along with the tanks. 6 months later, those same men would be racing 630 kilometers back the way they came, with Soviet forces closing in on the only escape route, trying to avoid a catastrophe even bigger than Stalingrad. So today, we're covering the full story of Operation Edelweiss. How the longest armored thrust of 1942 ran out of fuel, chasing oil, how the oil was destroyed before Germany could use it, and how 250,000 men barely made it out alive. To understand why Germany bet everything on this campaign, you have to understand the fuel problem. Germany had almost no domestic oil production worth mentioning. Its main source was the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, but Romanian output was nowhere near enough to sustain a mechanized war across multiple fronts. Synthetic fuel plants filled some of the gap, but a German high command study from May 1941 laid out the math. Monthly military requirements were running at around 7.25 million barrels. Domestic production and imports combined totaled about 5.35 million barrels. At that rate, German fuel reserves would be completely exhausted by August 1942. Now, look at what was sitting in the Caucasus. Baku alone produced roughly 24 million tons of oil in 1942. That was about 80% of all Soviet oil. Even the smaller fields at Maikop and Grozny accounted for another 10%. If Germany could take those fields, 2 things would happen simultaneously. The Wehrmacht would solve its own fuel crisis, and the Soviet war machine would lose the oil it needed to keep fighting. This is the context that people miss when they think of this campaign as a sideshow. For Hitler, the Caucasus was the main event. He said it directly. Without Caucasian oil, he would lose the war, and he was probably right. So in the spring of 1942, while the rest of the German High Command was focused on the Eastern Front as a whole, Hitler issued Directive 41. The plan called for a 2-pronged summer offensive. Army Group A, under Field Marshal Wilhelm List, would drive south into the Caucasus to capture the oil fields. Army Group B would push towards Stalingrad along the Don River. And here's the part that's important to understand. Army Group B's job at Stalingrad was not to take the city. It was to establish a blocking position on the Volga to protect Army Group A's left flank, while the real operation, the oil grab, played out to the south. Stalingrad was the shield. The Caucasus was the sword. That's how it was designed. The forces assembled for the Caucasus drive were enormous. Army Group A included Kleist's 1st Panzer Army, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, Roff's 17th Army, the Romanian 3rd Army, and air support from Luftflotte 4. Around 167,000 troops, 1,130 tanks, and 4,540 guns. And travelling with them were 15,000 oil industry workers. Technicians and engineers brought along specifically to restart oil production the moment the fields were captured. That detail tells you everything about how confident the German leadership was. They didn't just think they'd reach the oil. They brought the workforce to pump it. And at first, it looked like they were right to be confident. Once the offensive kicked off, the speed was extraordinary. Kleist's 1st Panzer Army drove roughly 400 kilometers from its starting line and helped capture Rostov-on-Don on July 23rd. Rostov was called the Gates of the Caucasus. Once it fell, the steppe beyond was wide open, and the Soviet forces in the area were in complete disarray. Kleist himself later said that in the earlier stages of the advance, he met little organized resistance. Most Soviet troops who were bypassed seemed more interested in finding a way home than in continuing the fight. For a few weeks in late July, it actually looked like the entire Soviet southern front might collapse. And then Hitler made the decision that would ultimately doom both campaigns. On July 23rd, the same day Rostov fell, he issued Directive 45. This directive did something that his own generals had warned against. It split Army Group South into two separate army groups and ordered them to pursue two major objectives simultaneously, rather than one after the other. Army Group A would continue south into the Caucasus. Army Group B, now operating independently, would push towards Stalingrad. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, which had been driving south with Kleist, was pulled away and redirected northeast towards Stalingrad. And here's the part that still frustrates military historians. Kleist later said the 4th Panzer Army's diversion wasn't even necessary. Instead, Hoth went south, clogged Kleist's roads, then turned north again 2 weeks later. By the time he reached Stalingrad, the Soviets had enough forces in place to stop him. He didn't need Hoth's help crossing the Don. And if Hoth had kept going towards Stalingrad instead of turning south in the first place, he probably could have taken the city in July before the Soviets had time to organize a defense. So in one directive, Hitler weakened the Caucasus drive by removing half its armor, delayed the Stalingrad thrust by 2 critical weeks, and ensured that neither operation had the resources to finish the job. But even without Hoth, the advance into the Caucasus was breathtaking on a map. After Rostov, the 1st Panzer Army covered over 480 kilometers in under 2 weeks and reached Maikop by August 9th. On the same day, Pyatigorsk fell, 240 kilometers to the east. The panzers were eating ground faster than at almost any point since Barbarossa. On the ground, though, the army was destroying itself. The advance was so fast that supply lines couldn't keep up. Fuel shortages hit almost immediately. The Black Sea route was considered too dangerous, so everything had to come by rail through the bottleneck at Rostov or by air. But rail capacity was nowhere near sufficient, and fuel delivery by air was expensive and unreliable. Panzer divisions would sometimes sit motionless for weeks, waiting for fuel to arrive. The supply trucks bringing fuel forward ran out of fuel themselves. At one point, the Germans were literally using camels to haul oil across the steppe. Roughly 40% of German tank losses during the advance were not from enemy action. They were mechanical breakdowns. Dust contamination, engine strain, and the sheer distance involved were chewing through the panzer force faster than the Soviets were. Now, the story of how Maikop actually fell is worth telling on its own, because it involves one of the more audacious special operations of the entire war. The Germans knew the Soviets would destroy the oil fields if they had time, and the Soviets had every intention of doing exactly that. Stalin had personally summoned a young mining engineer named Nikolai Baibakov and given him the job. The way Baibakov told the story after the war, Stalin pointed 2 fingers at his head and said something along the lines of, "If you fail to stop the Germans from getting our oil, you will be shot." Then, after a pause, Stalin added, "And when we have thrown the invader out, if we cannot restart production, we will shoot you again." Baibakov reportedly replied, "You leave me no choice, Comrade Stalin." And Stalin tapped his own temple and said, "The choice is here." So Baibakov set to work. His teams prepared demolition charges on wells and refineries across the Caucasus. The plan was to destroy everything the moment the Germans got close, but to do it in a way that could eventually be reversed once the fields were recaptured. To counter this, German intelligence sent in a Brandenburger commando unit. These were elite special forces trained in foreign languages, deception, and sabotage. A small team led by Freiherr Adrian von Fulkerson, made up of Baltic and Sudeten Germans who spoke Russian, infiltrated behind Soviet lines disguised as NKVD officers. They used captured Soviet trucks and passed through checkpoints using the chaos of the retreat as cover. When the German spearhead got close, Fulkerson's team went into action. They threw grenades to simulate an artillery attack, then cut Maikop's military communications. With no way to verify orders, and having already seen Fulkerson with their own commanding officer, the local Soviet garrison began evacuating on his urging. The German advance elements entered Maikop on August 9th against minimal resistance, and they found several oil production facilities still functioning. The Brandenburgers had pulled it off, but they hadn't pulled it off fast enough. Baibakov's demolition teams had already destroyed the bulk of the oil infrastructure. Wells were capped with concrete, refineries were wrecked, equipment had been stripped and shipped east. The oil fields at Maikop had been, in the words of one assessment, completely destroyed. Repairing them would take about a year of work, The Soviets even announced it publicly. The Germans, expecting to profit by the capture of Maikop, have miscalculated. They will not obtain Soviet oil. So think about where this leaves the German army. The tanks that ran out of fuel racing toward oil have arrived at the oil, and there's nothing there. The 15,000 oil industry workers who marched south with the panzers had nothing to do. After Maikop, the character of the campaign changed completely. The open steppe was behind them. Ahead were the Caucasus mountains. Kleist noticed the shift immediately. The Soviet forces they now encountered were local troops. They fought harder because they were defending their homes, and the terrain made that resistance far more effective. Mountain roads were perfect for ambushes and almost useless for tanks. Moving supplies forward became a nightmare. Food and ammunition had to be hauled up on mule trains. 4 days to bring supplies up, 4 days to evacuate a single casualty. And then something happened that captures the absurdity of the entire campaign. On August 21st, while the main offensive was grinding to a halt for lack of fuel, troops from the 1st Mountain Division climbed to the summit of Mount Elbrus, the highest peak in both the Caucasus and in all of Europe, and planted the Nazi flag on top of it. The climb had absolutely zero military significance. Goebbels celebrated it as a propaganda triumph. Hitler, to his credit on this one point, was furious. German propaganda was celebrating a mountaintop flag while the army starved for fuel in the valleys below. Through September and October, Kleist kept pushing. The 1st Panzer Army forced a crossing over the Terek River near Mozdok in early September, but the advance beyond that was agonizingly slow. By now, the other half of the problem was hitting full force. Air support and fuel that should have gone to Army Group A were being redirected to Stalingrad, where the 6th Army was being sucked into an urban battle that was consuming everything. The Caucasus campaign was being cannibalized to feed a fight 500 kilometers to the northeast that was never supposed to be the main effort. At the end of October, Kleist launched one last attempt to reach Grozny with a pincer attack. The right arm of the pincer captured Nalchik and pushed on to Alagir, but the attack stalled in rain and snow. A Soviet counterattack hit a Romanian division on the flank and collapsed it, forcing a retreat. German forces reached their absolute high water mark in early November near Ordzhonikidze, roughly 610 kilometers from their starting positions, and that was it. They would get no further. On September 9th, Hitler had fired List for failing to capture Grozny, and then, remarkably, took personal command of Army Group A himself. Even that made no difference. You can't will fuel into existence from a headquarters 1,000 kilometers away. By November 4th, all offensive operations in the Caucasus were officially suspended, and units began transferring out to reinforce Stalingrad. The campaign for the oil was over. Germany never reached Grozny, never came close to Baku, and the oil fields they did capture at Maikop produced nothing useful for the German war effort. And then, on November 19th, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, and everything changed. Soviet forces smashed through the Romanian armies guarding the flanks north and south of Stalingrad, and within 4 days had encircled the entire 6th Army. Suddenly, Army Group A, which was still stretched deep into the Caucasus at the end of a 600-kilometer supply line, was in mortal danger. The entire southern front behind them was crumbling. Kleist did the math. Soviet forces were roughly 65 kilometers from Rostov. His own troops were nearly 630 kilometers away. Rostov was the only major road and rail crossing connecting the Caucasus to the rest of the German front. If the Soviets reached it first, his entire army group, 18 divisions, including 11 panzer divisions, would be cut off south of the Don with no way out. It would be another Stalingrad, except bigger. Hitler, as he did at Stalingrad, initially refused to authorize a retreat. He hated giving ground. On one day, Kleist received an order that he was not to withdraw under any circumstances. That, as Kleist put it later, looked like a sentence of death. Then, the next day, remarkably, Hitler changed his mind and authorized the retreat. But with one condition. Kleist had to bring everything with him, all equipment, all supplies, in the middle of the Russian winter, across 630 kilometers of territory that was shrinking by the hour. The race for Rostov is the most tense sequence of this entire story, and it played out over roughly 6 weeks in January and February 1943. Kleist's northern flank, a stretch of roughly 960 kilometers, was protected by one thing and one thing only: the desperate resistance of Paulus's 6th Army, still holding out inside the Stalingrad pocket. Every day that Paulus kept fighting was another day that Soviet attention and resources were focused on Stalingrad, rather than on cutting the Rostov corridor. This was not a coordinated strategy. It was an accident of timing, but it saved Army Group A. Kleist later said the most dangerous time was the last half of January. Manstein, who was now commanding the newly formed Army Group Don and trying to hold open the corridor from the west, was under such pressure that Kleist had to send some of his own divisions north to help hold off the Soviet forces pushing down the Don toward Rostov. So Kleist was simultaneously retreating across 630 kilometers and lending out forces to help keep the escape route open. On January 31st, Paulus surrendered at Stalingrad. 91,000 men walked into Soviet captivity. Had Paulus surrendered 3 weeks earlier, Kleist's escape would have been impossible. When the Soviets finally took Rostov on February 14th, Kleist and Army Group A had already passed through. They made it. Barely. Kleist was promoted to Field Marshal for the achievement, pulling 250,000 men out of a trap that should have swallowed them whole. And 2 days after Rostov fell, something else happened. Soviet tanks rolled into Kharkov. Morale was at an all-time high. Stavka was convinced the Wehrmacht was finished. Some Soviet commanders were already planning operations to end the war by summer. They were about to overextend themselves in exactly the same way the Germans had in the Caucasus. And the man waiting for them, Erich von Manstein, was about to pull off what many historians still consider the single greatest counterattack of the entire Second World War. We have a whole video on that, and I'll link it at the end of this one. On February 13th and 17th, 1943, Soviet mountain infantry climbed Mount Elbrus and tore down the Nazi flags, replacing them with Soviet ones. The propaganda conquest was reversed within 6 months. Germany never resolved its fuel crisis. Romanian oil from Ploiești remained the main external source until Allied bombers systematically destroyed those refineries in 1944. Synthetic fuel plants filled some of the gap, but were themselves targeted by strategic bombing. By December 1944, Germany's fuel situation was so dire that the planners of the Ardennes offensive, the last major German attack of the war, based their entire operational plan on capturing American fuel dumps along the way. They estimated they had enough fuel for roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of the distance to their objective. The 15,000 oil workers who marched south with the panzers in the summer of 1942 went home empty-handed. Maikop produced nothing useful for Germany. Grozny was never reached. Baku was never even in range of German fighters, let alone ground troops. Everyone knows what happened at Stalingrad. Almost nobody talks about the Caucasus. But in many ways, the Caucasus was the real failure, because Stalingrad was only supposed to guard the flank of this offensive. The oil was the prize. The oil was always the prize, and Germany never got a drop of it. Instead, it burned through fuel it couldn't replace, to reach oil it couldn't use, and nearly lost an entire army group doing it. The Caucasus campaign didn't just fail, it proved that the war was already unwinnable. Germany was running on empty before the first panzer crossed the Don.